we can hear you and
Yes,
see you,
great.
Dr.
And
Ibrahim.
it's really great to be among friends and colleagues and to share this opportunity of the process of discovery and research that has actually started and was conducted very quietly, even though, Samir style, even though this is not very typical for his project leader, our friend Raimundo Soto. But suddenly now we discovered that we really do have like some 25s and very tremendous stock of knowledge. Unfortunately, on this topic, which people and countries and societies would like to avoid, but anyway, it's we are stuck with it in this region, that we have to deal with the crisis of the state failure and the challenge legitimacy and conflicts that has both macro and micro implications for societies. So I would like first of all to thank Raimundo and Samir and the distinguished researchers and the chairpersons and commentators who will be presenting and discussing and disciplining kind of the exchanges and the deliberation that we will have. So, I'm very impressed really about the 5 stages that actually we have a very well-designed project that has 5 stages. The first one started with the macro perspective, case study perspective, another one that looked at the micro aspects of conflicts, looking at surveys and how conflict affects societies. And then, of course, the economic interdependence in terms of trade and supply chain and so on, and how actually this interact with conflict. And then, of course, the ongoing or prospective phase, which Samir and Raimundo will tell us about tomorrow. So, without further ado, I just wanted to highlight these points. And once again, to welcome you all and to thank Samir and Raimundo, and to invite Samir to give us some perhaps more substantive welcome before we go into the sessions. Thank you.
Dr. Samir? Dr. Samir, can you?
And disconnect with me. It's my turn?
Yes, please, Dr. Samir. And if the connection is not too good, you may wish to switch off the camera.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. Let me start. Thank you, Ibrahim, for your introductory words. And permit me just a few introductory words on my own. Since the end of World War II, there have been more than 120 civil conflicts in the world. The Arab world has had its full share of armed conflicts, beginning with the creation of Israel in 1948 and the emergence of the Palestinian question. Aside from this, the region has witnessed many civil and other conflicts. The Ba'ath Party, 1963 coup d'etat, Lebanon's long-lasting civil war, the Syrian civil war of 1991 to 2002, and the overthrow of the Iraqi leadership in 2003 by a US-led invasion. And then we have the more recent civil uprisings of 2010 in 5 Arab countries, namely Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. Only Tunisia succeeded in establishing a new democratic order. Egypt turned back to what it was before. Syria's ruling class has been able to maintain its power, by sheer force, though at the cost of involving direct foreign power intervention, while other countries have been suffering from civil strife that yet to be resolved. In contrast with previous, the uprisings of the prevailing of Tunisia to lead to a breakthrough in inclusive and democratic and consequently in the wider region. By comparison, other regions of the world have managed to make greater progress and move forward towards a more democratic order. While the economic development of the Arab world in the post-war period has kept pace with other regions, it has managed to remain one of the most conflictual areas. This is one of the major reasons that has generally kept it in the non-democratic zone with uncertain peaceful prospects for development. It is with this in mind that the Economic Research Forum launched in 2017 this multi-dimensional research project on conflict, peace, building, and post-conflict transition in war-afflicted Arab countries, with the major aim of promoting constructive knowledge around national post-conflict development and state-building agendas that will lay the grounds for the region's sustainable national peace and equitable development. I started this work with Brahim, and then of course Brahim I had to do other things, take over the ERF's management, and even go to Sudan as Minister of Finance. Raimundo Soto took over in a very distinguished manner. Raimundo Soto and I are very grateful for the unflinching support of ERF management during the course of this project, from its initiation to its completion. We're also grateful to the Ford Foundation for its generous financial support of the project. And of course, we owe a great debt to our colleagues in the various research teams for their cooperation in helping us fulfill the project's objectives, especially given that at times we may have been too demanding of them. Hopefully, the research findings of the various components of the project will bear fruit by alerting policymakers to the region's path to an inclusive and peaceful development. Turning to the conference itself, today and tomorrow, permit me first to welcome all our distinguished speakers and friends with whom Brahim, Raimundo, and I have had the distinct pleasure of cooperating over the past few years. Today's meeting will include two sessions. The first takes up micro-level analysis of conflict in Mena. The speaker is Tilman Brook, and the lead commentator Nader Albani. The session's moderator is Nasreen Salti. The second session takes up post-conflict growth in Mena. The speaker is Shahir Zaki, and the lead commentator Bassam Youssef. The session's moderator is Ibrahim Al-Badawi. Tomorrow's meeting will include three sessions. The first is on regional cooperation and conflict in Mena. The speaker is Ahmed Waneem, and the lead commentator is, remind me, Shireen?
Lead commentator is Dr. Lahsan Ashey.
Lahsan Ali. The moderator is Katarzyna Tsildo. The second session is on regional experience and lessons learned. The speaker is Raimundo Soto, and the lead commentator Nohal Makkawi, and the moderator Adil Malik. The closing session on presentation of the project on sustained political and economic transformation will have three speakers: Raimundo Soto, Shahir Zaki, and Shanta Dibarjian. I will have the pleasure of moderating. One final word, Shireen, this is for you and for Brahim. I wish this conference could have been held not online, but in Cairo or elsewhere. It would have been great to meet our colleagues and friends in person. Perhaps keep it in mind, God willing, on some other occasion. Thank you. On to you now, I think, to the session one, right?
Yes. This project has been particularly lucky with fantastic passionate leadership with Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi, Dr. Samir Maqdisi, and Dr. Raimondo Soto. So we're really looking forward to the very rich discussion over the next 2 days. And Dr. Samir has just shown us how persistence had seen that project right through to the very last minute, despite all the connectivity problems from Beirut as well. So we're really grateful. And with that, I give the floor to Dr. Nasreen Salti, who will be moderating the first session with Dr. Tillman Brook as a speaker and Dr. Neda Qabbani as a lead commentator. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, ERF, for organizing this, for giving me a chance, first as one of the contributing papers, co-authors, and now to attend this final product, which seems incredibly exciting. Without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce our main speaker for this first session, Dr. Tillman Brook, who is the founder and director of the International Security and Development Center in Berlin. He's also the head of the research group on economic development and food security at the Leibniz Institute of Vegetable and Ornamental Crops in Großbeeren near Berlin, and professor of food security, state fragility, and climate change at the Natural Resources Institute of the University of Greenwich. He's also the co-founder and co-director of the Households in Conflict Network. His research focuses on the behavior and the welfare of poor and vulnerable households in conflict-affected, fragile, and humanitarian emergency settings, and on research methods in conflict settings. He obtained a doctorate in economics at the University of Oxford. It is great to meet you, Dr. Brook. You have 30 minutes for the presentation. I will send you a chat message 5 minutes before, just to warn you. And I look forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nasreen, for the warm welcome, and to Ibrahim and Samir and all the wonderful team at the ERF office who've done such a fantastic job in keeping us on track and keeping us together and making this possible. Thank you also, of course, to the Ford Foundation, and thank you, last but not least, to my discussant, Neda Qabbani, who did the impossible and to discuss one of my almost finished presentations. So I would like to share my screen now and share it like that. I'm afraid I can't see the chat while I present, so please feel free to just simply butt in. So if you need to say something, or if the sound isn't good, or if the, yeah, so I'm just going to look at my slides now. So this is a wonderful project, and I'm really grateful to have been involved in it. And we had a number of papers, 8 papers at least, which contributed to this. And I want to just draw some lessons from what we have learned on the one hand, but also look at perhaps what we don't know yet, and what are some remaining knowledge gaps, or what are some ongoing research efforts in other fields, to have a sense of the direction and the dynamics of this research field. And we'll start sort of bottom up with this whole session today, and then move on step by step to the more meso and macro levels through the other projects or part projects, so that until finally we end probably tomorrow with a bird's eye view of the region and the challenges. But here today we have sort of the founding pieces, and sorry, I just need to click one more time here. This is what we did in this part project. Yeah, this is all the evidence and topics that we worked on. And if it looks a little bit messy, it is because there were, that's sort of a little bit the nature of microeconomic research. Yeah, you have a very specific research question, you have a very specific setting, you look for specific data. If you can find it, that can be a challenge. We come back to that later. You try to put that together somehow. And then you make a specific finding, which, you know, macroeconomists will say have probably no external validity. And yet my point is that piece by piece, you know, you're putting these puzzle pieces together and a larger picture emerges. And here we talked a lot about conflict, about impact, about children, about evidence, about refugees, about host populations, you know, all these words that you can see here big. And of course, centering out Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. Yeah, these are some of the countries we really worked on. But I want to try to make this a little more systematic. And so let me give you first an overview of all the papers that were presented. I'm not going to read this out. You can find it on the website as well. There you can find it with links to all the papers. They're all online. So anybody listening in here for the first time who's not familiar with this work, you can read up on all of these. They're really wonderful papers on quite a broad range of topics. And in order to sort of structure that a little bit, I'm trying to break it down a bit further. And I'm also trying to give you some highlights of what some of these papers found. First of all, the themes studied, and there are really two broad themes that have emerged. You could probably cut the themes in a different way, but I thought this was a useful way of doing it. So on the one hand, there's a lot of discussion of the refugees in the regions, people who crossed the international boundary in order to be safe and to be able to provide for themselves and their families. And this is, I think, important both for policy, but also for research and the host populations. And there's a very pragmatic issue which makes this research possible, and that is data availability. In the past, often we had data on either the host populations or on the refugees, and it was hard to compare because they're very different populations. Yeah, they're very hard to compare. Nowadays, we have luckily more integrated surveys which cover both subgroups, so to speak, of people resident in a given country, and we can directly compare with the same analysis, the same methodology, the same approach, how people are doing. And I think that's absolutely invaluable. I remember myself leading some data collection in the region, and then the government said, but we can't talk to those. They're refugees and they're going to go home soon. Yeah, so they won't be here in a while. That at the time that was Iraqi refugees in Syria. Yeah, they're our brothers, but we won't survey them because very soon they'll be back home. Yeah, little did one know that they wouldn't go home for a while. So nowadays we have this data, and we see how refugees and host populations, how they do in the labor market, what jobs they have, how much they earn, what is the wage differential between refugees and host populations, who gets basic services, who can access them, how much do they access them, do they get enough, are they curtailed in their access if they're both refugees and host populations perhaps competing for limited services, and the government and transfers from government or from donors or from aid agencies or NGOs, cash transfers, for example, do they help? What impact do they have? Do they achieve the intended objective? So there's a set of papers around that, and we'll look at some of their key findings in a moment. The second set of papers focuses on human capital. And it looks at adults, for example, adult mental health, for example, which is, I think, an important topic which has been understudied, especially in the economics profession, and underappreciated for its significant importance in often preventing people from working, even where maybe legally they are allowed to work, refugees, for example, but also children. The determinants of their wealth, of their health and well-being, stunting status, for example, whether they're right height for their age, their educational participation, entertainment, their health, generally their health status. And then, of course, the intertemporal connections between these things. What was your history as a child? What conflict did you experience as a child? And what well-being do you reach today? Those are also important topics. And these are all connected in different ways. And it's hard to pick out individual things. But let me show you what some of the key insights are. The first group of papers, the livelihoods of refugee and host populations. There are 4 insights, perhaps, which are particularly interesting. Some of them may be confirming what we suspected before. Some of them maybe answering open questions, some of them even giving counterintuitive findings, which of course is interesting too. One paper looks at adults who had childhood war trauma, experiencing conflict at close sight. They have clearly much later worse human development outcomes. And the interesting thing is here that this connects conflict and human development over time. Yeah, what mattered in the past, what happened in the past matters to what happens today. And I think that's important lesson to bear in mind, because it also means that not all current policies can necessarily deal with the outcomes today if the outcomes are predetermined by what happened in the past, or it needs very different policies to deal with these traumas from the past. We come back to the mental health issue in a moment. A labor market study looked at how refugees who are more or less qualified, to what extent it was their skills that led to their labor market outcomes, for example, their wage, or whether they were simply discriminated. And so like sort of breaking down the wage gap between refugees and non-refugees, and finding that this mattered along the gradient of qualification. And it was actually the more qualified who were, relatively speaking, more discriminated than the less qualified, which is interesting. And maybe there's differential labor market responses needed for people who are extremely low skilled compared to people who are actually extremely high skilled. And I could easily think of, doctors who are not allowed to practice once they cross a border, whereas a building site worker might be able to practice as a building site worker, whether they live at home or abroad. A high share of refugees was the third finding in a given area reduces the, no, sorry, this should say, says reduce the met, I should say, or increase the unmet, pardon me, it's a typo, healthcare needs of the host populations. In other words, there is increasing competition if there are more refugees, or increasing demand, you could perhaps say, for healthcare from refugees and from the host populations, but a limited supply of healthcare. And so, of course, the local host population has unmet healthcare needs with more refugees present, and that can lead to tensions. It can reduce social cohesion potentially, and it could be a channel of future problems. But on the other hand, we can also see that refugees can have absolutely positive impacts on local socioeconomic outcomes, such as employment, education, and living standards for the host populations. So there can be win-win situations and outcomes from this point of view. Couple of key insights for the side of things of children, in particular the human capital accumulation of children. Again, we find in a different paper that, or not I don't find, but the authors find, we find in this project that early childhood exposure to violence reduces childhood height. So it increases stunting, probably via a reduced breastfeeding at an early age in the children during this difficult time of conflict. And that more generally experiencing traumatic conflict events makes children more likely to behave themselves violently, which I think is also another often overlooked topic, that we know that violence can beget violence, but violence can also beget violence across domains. So experiencing violent conflict can make children more violent in their behavior towards their peers, for example. Yeah, and that's a worrying trend, of course. So this is not about war-inducing war. This is about war-inducing interpersonal violence in social spheres. In another paper on children, other co-authors found out that living in high conflict area increases child immunization rates, which is a very surprising finding at first sight, because you might think public health care suffers when there's fighting and violence and insecurity. But this was a case study in Iraq. Probably the high presence of international organizations in healthcare in those areas helped provide or explain this increased provision of vaccine and healthcare services, counteracting the probably negative, sort of the pure negative conflict effects that are likely to be present in normal conflict settings. Finally, one interesting paper found that cash transfers to children who are from refugee families can help them attend school, help them grow physically, and actually also very important, help prevent early child marriages, especially for girls, of course. So cash transfers are sometimes not that difficult to organize, and they're not even that costly, and yet they have very positive and tangible dividends, as the authors found out with this very rigorous identification strategy. So that's a good piece of news. There are things that can be done. So this was a sort of Twitter-style quick race through the different findings. I'd like to place them a bit more in context and see also some of the gaps and some of the other ongoing research. There were a couple of themes, if you look at these papers, that weren't studied. Now, this wasn't a decision of the project organizers, because we had a call for papers and we received these papers, and they were fantastic papers. We were glad we had them, but actually relatively little or no work was done on food security and agriculture, on informality, and except for the child marriage, perhaps on adverse coping strategies. Also relatively little on the actual poverty. I think maybe we take it for granted that displaced people are poor, but quite how poor and who's more poor and less poor is a question that hasn't really been addressed in this literature or elsewhere so much. We focused a lot on refugees, but there's also significant internal displacement within conflict countries, which is important. And there's temporary mobility, even by refugees. Just think of the Lebanese-Syrian border back and forth for multiple reasons: livelihoods, agriculture, etc., and remittances as well. Other issues which we didn't study so much were political mobilization, or trust in governance, or trust in other agencies and institutions, and also social cohesion between groups. I alluded to it when I talked about the tension between host and displaced populations, but there could be other groups. Even within the displaced community could be different religious or ethnic subgroups who might mobilize against each other or have more or less trust. So I think there's a lot still that remains to be studied topically. And one thing I want to draw attention to is the importance of institutional barriers and of policies. I'm sure we come back to that in other presentations during this fascinating workshop, but here's a quote from an interesting report, which I think shows this very well. And the quote says, labor regulations and an unstable policy environment confine vocational training and related livelihoods interventions to restricted and rapidly shifting space. Thus, individuals are trained in sectors that are already saturated with labor market entrants, or in professions such as hairdressing that now have been closed to non-Jordanians. So the question is, how do governments regulate labor markets and what do they allow? And all too often, they're very defensive and very restrictive, preventing the sort of market forces from being at play for the benefit of the actors, as we saw in the papers of the benefits on the labor markets, including for the host populations. I have done a study which is ongoing in Jordan, and we looked at the effects of work permits on poverty, and we see that having a work permit reduces the risk of living below the national poverty line in Jordan for Syrian refugees, and it increases income, and it actually makes people less dependent on aid or on government transfers. And so it depends on, it's irrespective of which poverty line you draw. You can see that here in the picture, the blue and the red representing different poverty lines. But so providing work permits can be very impactful and have strong benefits, actually, both to the displaced and the host populations. And we saw that having a work permit, excuse the typo, decreases the likelihood of sending children to work and increases the amount by the displaced household spent on education. And this was irrespective of the amount of income that the household had. So very important welfare benefits, and we looked at cash transfers earlier, but there are other policies which don't in itself directly cost the government money, which can also be pursued, which are also helpful. And I think the Jordanian experience here is very positive and illuminating. I said earlier, the other topic that I think is vastly underappreciated is the importance of trauma, and especially in this region where there is so much political tension, even if it's non-violent, but also so much violence in different forms and in different constellations. And here's a report from which I'd like to cite again briefly. So the mental health needs among the refugee community far exceed the amount of services offered. And despite many mental health services provided by state and non-state organizations, there's limited capacity within the sector to deliver in Lebanon, for example. And it continues to say the importance of ensuring the basic needs prior to or in combination with psychosocial support was emphasized by their survey respondents in the study. Some informants stated that the best way to reduce the stress levels is to make sure that the humanitarian assistance includes basic supplies such as shelter and food. And I think this is not something that has been mainstreamed enough and that has been thought through enough, including by the international donors and organizations. And I'd encourage them to take that on board. There's some more quotes here which show that sometimes it's not just labor market reform, or it's not just mental health service provision. You have to think this together, because if somebody is really badly off, then they cannot function properly. And so functionality matters. Here's a quote: more than 20% of respondents felt severe or extreme level of difficulty in daily work during the last 30 days. And it says, promoting livelihood programs was the top priority for the respondents when asked for complementary activities for people in need of mental health services. However, the psychosocial state of the target group might be a barrier for the successful livelihood programming. I think this is really, really key. Yeah. So if functionality levels are improved and pain levels are decreased by a focused approach on bodily symptoms, the likelihood of completing a training program will increase. So we can create synergies by thinking more comprehensively and thinking more in an integrated way. And I have one ongoing study from one empirical setting in the Middle East where we directly measure the number of conflict events that people are exposed to. And we also measure the depression score, where more is worse. And we see there's a very strong positive correlation between the number of conflict events rising to the right and the depression score rising to the top. And these differences are significant from each other. And so if we have 2/3 of the population that have experienced multiple conflict events, showing serious signs of depression, then I think that says something about their ability to function in everyday life, and especially in the labor market. So even if we allow them to work, they may not be able to. Again, I think this has been underappreciated. Now, the countries that were studied, as you may have seen in my earlier list, were focused a lot on Syria and its neighboring countries, especially Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, on Iraq, of course, and on Palestine. But as this small screenshot from the ACLED data website shows, there's all sorts of conflict events in the last 12 months alone in the whole MENA region and beyond. Actually, there's a lot of conflict around the world, I must say. This is not specific to the region. And if there are few dots in some places, it's merely because there are actually few people living there. But in the project, unfortunately, we didn't have papers on the wars in Libya or Yemen or on violence in other countries. And I think that's something that in the future would be worth addressing to learn from that. Some of these countries do have good data and they have violence. And so good analysis should be possible. And data is exactly the point. From a study I conducted in Syria, I wanted to show you that even if there are high levels of violence, as you can see here by especially the black line, which designate explosions and remote violence, we were able, under admittedly difficult circumstances, to conduct an impact evaluation with nationwide large-scale data collection at baseline, midline, and endline through different phases of the late conflict period, I must say. I don't think it's possible in any conflict setting, and Yemen may be a place where it would become very challenging, but there are often windows of data collection, and it's often better to collect some data than to collect no data, to inform policy debates and to inform our learning and our understanding of the dynamics in the region. So in the studies that the project conducted, survey data was the most commonly used, either cross sections or even panel data. As I said earlier, often comparable data for host or refugee populations, and sometimes even from multiple countries, making comparison within a single paper across several countries, which is very valuable, and often matched with all sorts of conflict event data, which is so important for understanding the context and understanding how exposed individuals are and their households are to conflict and to violence. And this is something I've worked on a lot, the conflict exposure and how to measure conflict exposure. And I think it's quite obvious once you start thinking about it that different people are exposed to conflict differently, even in the same location and the same point in time. Think of a man and a woman, husband and wife, who would feel differently about the risk of being exposed to conflict in their locality. Maybe the man would dare to go out at night and the woman wouldn't, for example. Yeah, or maybe the young son, aged 18, is worried of being conscripted forcefully or otherwise into one or the other side of the conflict, whereas maybe his same aged sister wouldn't worry about that. So conflict affects different people differently, and it's important to account for that. And many of these studies that we discuss here today have done that, and that's to be commended for that. There is a lot of data that perhaps hasn't been used. So there are other conflict countries in the region which have survey data, and unfortunately we weren't able to procure papers from them. Interestingly, there's also a lot of administrative data because there are a lot of aid programs and help programs from governments, from international organizations, or from NGOs. And I think that's worth exploring more. And it requires these organizations to some extent to let go and to value the data assets they have and to reduce the suspicion of analysis and to share more. And ERF has been a fantastic resource for sharing, for example, labor force surveys, but I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I hope that ERF will have support in the future to help build its data archives and create access for researchers who individually often can't get access to, for example, administrative data. This needs trailblazers to make that possible. Remote sensing is another example where we can learn especially about conflict settings, because the satellites are still taking pictures even if shooting on the ground. And we can use other techniques. I'll show an example in a moment, and we could conduct more impact evaluations to learn from settings where organizations and donors and agencies intervene on the ground. And I think learning by doing is important, but not just the doing, also the learning. So that's a large scope for that. Here's a study. This is our Syrian data where we have analyzed some of that Syrian data using some machine learning. And you see a benchmark in gray there, sort of fixed effects approach on food consumption score, household dietary diversity score, and risky coping strategy index of a couple of food security outcomes. This is not the point of the presentation here to go into that, but we have been able to validate and expand our findings by using what is in principle good quality data, but by applying some machine learning techniques to it, and thereby sort of pushing the frontier of what we can find out from the data under these difficult circumstances. So I think when you don't have perfect data, then having additional resources for how to analyze it is actually extremely valuable. And that's just what I want to show here. And this is the second example from the same study. So for food consumption score, the variables that machine learning identified to be particularly important were the conflict events. And so this shows just how important the link is between conflict exposure and the experience of conflict, whether it's the last year or the last month in your area, compared to the sort of thing we control for in household surveys, usually like age of household head or your disability or female headed or all these sort of land size, etc., which are much less important than the conflict. So accounting for these things is important, if only to avoid omitted variable bias. So two more slides, and I hope I'm on time. One is the lessons learned for research. I think there's more data than often assumed. That's something this project has definitely demonstrated to me, that the authors were capable of finding and succeeded in finding amazing data sources and doing fantastic things with them. But there also remain huge gaps of knowledge across countries, topics, and methods. And connecting these themes and approaches like labor market with mental health will pay dividends and may create new insights for policy. And there's a key role for knowledge brokers like ERF or like the Ford Foundation to facilitate these processes and to build critical mass, because for the individual researcher, it's difficult to do that. And having this encouragement and supportive community, outside your home department, so to speak, where people might be working on all sorts of things, but not the economic impact of conflict is incredibly helpful and valuable. Final slide is the lessons learned for policymakers. I think there's some very clear sort of unfounded fears and taboos based on ideology and preconceived notions, for example, about having refugees work. And I think both analytical economics would suggest, but empirical research from this project confirms that things like work permits, getting people to work, can be extremely beneficial for all sides. And so we need to understand more about that and make the case more stronger with governments to, if the refugees are there, let them work so they can take care of their own livelihoods. And they often prefer that anyway, rather than getting handouts. And so it's even better for the host population. Basically, the economy is growing, and that's important. There are also, unfortunately, incorrect assumptions and thus incorrect policy implications about, for example, the expected length of stay of refugees. And if you really think they're only there very temporarily, then you might want to exclude them from the labor market. But if you think they're going to be there for much longer, and why wouldn't the Middle East anybody think that conflict is ongoing for a long time, then integrating them basically, as I said, grows your economy and is good for both sides, and you should do that. And I think the policies often don't consider enough the general equilibrium impacts of displacement. The sort of macroeconomic, the growth impacts. Maybe that builds a bridge to some of the later sessions. But also, and that's my very, very last point here, what I call the second order scope for policies to enhance human development. So the first order would be, stop the war, stop the conflict, stop the fighting, and turn the Middle East into sort of, United States of Middle East and have economic integration. Well, in the absence of peace and apple pie, and if the conflict must go on, if we have to accept that for a given, then even in the absence of peace, there's a lot you can do to strengthen the human well-being and the social well-being and the economic well-being of individuals and households. And I think this research has helped contribute to understanding how that is possible. And I'd like to thank ERF for making that possible. Thank you very much. Sorry if I took too long.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brück. This was incredible, weaving together 8 very different papers in a lot of ground for discussion and comments. And I do invite participants to put their questions in the Q&A section that's available, the function's available on Zoom, or participate live by raising your hand in the discussion that will happen at the end of the session after the comments by the lead commentator, Dr. Nader Abani. Again, a great pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Abani, a former colleague even. So Dr. Abani is Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Director of the Governance and Development Program with the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He also serves as non-resident Senior Fellow with a Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and is a research fellow at ERF. As a development researcher and practitioner with over 20 years experience, Dr. Abani has served as senior fellow and director of research with the Brookings Doha Center and a director of policy and research at the Silatech Foundation. He was the founding director of the Syrian Development Research Center at the Syria Trust for Development. And during his career, he's held positions on the economics faculty of the American University of Beirut, where I can attest he is an incredibly collegial and supportive senior colleague. Also on the research staff of the US Department of Agriculture and the California State Senate. Dr. Abbani has worked as a consultant for several international organizations, including the World Bank and the International Labor Organization and the United Nations Development Program. And he has served on the advisory boards of several nonprofit organizations and social enterprises. He has published policy papers and academic articles on a wide variety of development issues, mostly covering the Middle East. He holds a BA from Claremont McKenna College and a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nader Abbani's comments on the previous presentation. Dr. Abbani, you have 15 minutes, and I will, again, in the chat, send you a 3-minute alert, which I didn't have to do for Dr. because he was right on time. So look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you so much, Nasreen, for that suitably embarrassing introduction. I really appreciate, and thank you so much to ERF for inviting me to be discussing on this really excellent panel. I will try to take less than 15 minutes because I noticed we have like around 60 participants, and I'm sure they have a lot of questions of Tilman and the research that was conducted. So let me just kind of summarize a few key impressions here. First of all, that the importance of this research, I think, is the first and foremost thing. So ERF really has embarked on this project, and I mean, there was always research done on conflict, but it was never as coordinated as under the project with Samir and Raimondo and Dr. Ibrahim. And I think we see the benefits of that engagement and the value of doing that kind of research. I mean, conflict has become a key defining characteristic of the region, and ERF has been doing work in terms of collecting data and incorporating collection of data on refugees, for example, in their survey work in Jordan. So they were able to expand their scope of work to incorporate issues of refugees and some conflict and issues related to, let's say, macroeconomic stability in conflict countries and things that they could do. But this project really tried to go a little bit much more in depth and to really figure out what was possible in terms of the data, in terms of the questions that could be asked, in terms of shedding light on these key issues of importance to the region. And it's really a testament to ERF's agility and its ability to adapt and respond to changing circumstances that allowed them to do this and do this so effectively and with such great insights. And I mean, when this project started, I agree with Tilman. I think, we didn't realize how much could be done. I say because I was involved in at least one paper. I mean, I was involved in one paper on the project, but it was very impressive to see really what could be done given what the expectations were to begin with, in terms of expanding access to the kinds of questions you want to ask, into the kinds of research that could be done. And besides providing insights into these questions, it's invaluable, the kind of work that's been done and the kind of results that have been found in terms of policy engagement. And let me Tilman focused on a few key findings, but let me unpack a couple of them just to think about what this means for the region in terms of policy engagement. First, we saw how impact evaluations can really be especially important in terms of engaging, in terms of identifying what's going on. And these can be used for donor engagement. It can be used by international organizations and others for policy advocacy. And one key paper from this research is the positive effects of cash transfer programs on formal educational outcomes, on child labor, health outcomes, and early marriage among girls. That was the paper that was presented, that was done by Wael Musa, which Nasreen was a co-author on. So the results are very fascinating, interesting, but then this can this can mobilize resources, and it can be proof points for the donor community and for international organizations about what can be done and the positive impacts they can have. Another important aspect is the counterintuitive research findings that could emerge, such as Nofeld's paper on evidence that children residing in high conflict areas in Iraq are more likely to be vaccinated. This is especially counterintuitive, and Tillman pointed out for one explanation for this is the president of international organizations and humanitarian organizations working on in these areas. But the policy implications are twofold. First of all, that areas in Iraq and other conflict countries that are low conflict may be suffering in terms of deficits in public health services that need to be taken into consideration. And the assumption shouldn't be just on focus on high conflict areas within these countries. It also points out to the fact that there are channels in high conflict areas of these countries that can be used to provide additional services to people residing in those high conflict areas. So all these kind of point to really tangible policy implications that can be built on. Another interesting finding are that individuals that were exposed to terror attacks in their childhood are affected negatively in terms of mental health and are more likely to engage in risky behavior, such as smoking, alcohol consumption, and less likely to finish compulsory and secondary education. But the interesting finding here is that the impact on educational attainment is more pronounced among boys and children in higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, maybe possibly a slightly counterintuitive finding, but it tells you that higher socioeconomic backgrounds may provide some resiliency in some cases, but not necessarily others. And it's only research that can really identify these heterogeneous outcomes that policymakers need to know, because otherwise you miss out on targeting your interventions in the most effective way possible. So all these are just to highlight some of the takeaways on the policy implications of some of this research that are so important. And it also is a call to essentially maybe continue this research effort, even though maybe the current phase of the project is done. It's really important to develop this further. And Tillman pointed out that there are major issues that are still remain to be addressed in this kind of research. He pointed to security, agricultural, effective other sectors, informality, coping strategies, internal displacement, political mobilization, trust, social cohesion. These are some of the key points. A lot of these, if you notice, relate to countries that are affected by conflict, especially neighboring countries, but especially countries that are experiencing conflict. And this is one of the gaps. Even though there was a lot of research, let's say, on Syria in terms of the project and neighboring countries, not so much inside the country. And that's more difficult, obviously. But Tillman also highlighted several research findings from the work that he's doing on projects outside the scope of this program that are in Syria itself. And it highlights the importance of doing the kind of work on the ground in countries of conflict. What are the kinds of work that can be done? Impact evaluations are especially important, given the policy implications and the valuable information that donors can assess, that can take away from this. Billions of dollars are being spent in terms of support for, let's say, countries in conflict, both within the countries and in neighboring countries. And one key, and obviously we're in a period of time right now when donor support is being focused elsewhere, in Europe, in Ukraine, and in other conflicts. There's probably some fatigue in terms of the Middle East. It's very important now, especially, to be able to demonstrate the positive impacts of these interventions and to identify ways of making sure that the donor funds can be extended further, and can be applied more effectively. And this kind of work is key for this. Tillman also mentioned survey work, much more difficult in countries of conflict, but not impossible, especially if you're willing to do some compromises on focusing on areas where conflict is less within the countries, but try to then extrapolate some of the findings to the national scope. And this is the kind of work that organizations like ERF can spearhead, but obviously it's going to take a different approach in terms of how it works, how to be able to mobilize resources and expertise to do this and to generate this kind of data. In conflict countries, there's a huge issue in terms of research capacity and in terms of data collection capacity. The last labor market survey that was conducted in Syria was in 2018. The civil war in Syria and the civil conflict started in 2012, which means for 6 years, the government was actually out there collecting data on labor markets. The final round, the data was of dubious quality. It was eventually pulled from the website. There currently is a new director of the Syrian Bureau of Statistics who is keen to get this started. But there's lack of capacity, there's a lack of funding, and this makes sense because countries of conflict really have to manage priorities, and data collection isn't always the top of the list. There's also kind of little interest in policymakers in terms of these kinds of standard surveys. One of the key issues that organizations like the Central Bureau of Statistics face is trying to get other government agencies to request data from them. They have their hands full in terms of just managing the economy or managing labor markets or dealing just simply with basic means of ensuring that people are able to survive and cope. And so these are our major bottlenecks. The third aspect is very weak institutional capacity. Many of the best researchers have left. Those who remain are keen to work, but they don't have the resources. They sometimes lack the knowledge and capacity and the networks. And I guess the next step, my pitch for next stage in this kind of project is to begin reaching out to researchers within conflict countries to try to build capacity and to try to support them in doing this kind of research. Obviously, it has to be done in coordination with researchers outside. And it has to be done, with respect to ensuring proper safety and procedures are in place. Doesn't mean working on the ground, but there are institutions on the ground that can be developed. Another aspect is that dollars can go a long way in countries of conflict. Right now, if you look at, the simple funding that can generate the excellent papers that were for the study would go even further, engaging researchers in conflict countries. One more point to consider before I turn it over to Nasreen and the audience is to think about the kinds of nature and kinds of questions that could be answered. We've talked about impact evaluations. We talked about trying to do a bit of survey work, maybe using machine learning to try to cover some of the gaps. But there's a lot of interesting questions that present themselves in countries of conflict that no one's really doing any work on. I'll give a couple of examples. I'm not even sure how to translate them into proper research questions, but these are the kinds of issues that countries of conflict really are struggling with. One example, for example, in the context of Syria is tax authorities. Desperate for income, they're overtaxing businesses and forcing many to close. This is having a huge negative repercussion on livelihoods, on business activity, and it's cannibalizing future revenue streams for the government. And this is, sometimes people think of this in terms of regimes, but much of the revenues are being taken and derived to pay for salaries of public servants in this kind of context. So the kind of work that researchers can do is to really highlight the negative impact of some of these policies that countries of conflict may be pursuing and the long-term repercussions. Research has an incredibly important role to play here in terms of trying to highlight the negative policies and to promote solid ones. Another example may be in the context of let's say Yemen. There's a lot of bottlenecks right now in terms of policy development in Yemen. One example is for example Yemen's internet capacity, which is then connected to communications and to electronic transfers and to all kinds of information. Yemen's internet capacity can be doubled currently, basically with a flip of a switch. An extra cable has been established in Aden, and right now it's just political bottlenecks that have prevented it. It's the kind of work that reporters would do, but the kind of work that researchers could do is essentially, hypothetically imagine what could be achieved if internet capacity or electricity capacity or other capacities in countries like Yemen could be doubled. What would the impact be on livelihoods? What would the impact be on education in terms of reaching children who are out of school? These hypotheticals are important because these are the kinds of considerations that policymakers are not taking into account that could. It relates to the kind of question that Tilman pointed out in places like Jordan, where the assumption is, let's say, refugees are going to take jobs from citizens, where in fact, in many cases, providing work permits you end up with refugees taking jobs that might not have gone to citizens, and can reduce their dependence on humanitarian assistance, and can increase economic activity, and can actually be possibly a benefit to themselves and the country. So it's these kinds of underlying assumptions that need to be challenged, and that research can play a very key and important role in informing, that I think is possibly part of the next stage of a more ambitious project that I hope ERF will continue to undertake. And those are my 2 cents. I hope they were helpful, and I look forward to the other comments and questions from the audience. Thank you, Nasreen. Thank you, Tilman.
Thank you, Nader. We're exactly on time, so that leaves us with 10 minutes. One for Tilman to respond, but also to take some questions from the audience. There are a few in the Q&A section that I will be summarizing after I hear from Tilman, if he wants to address any of the comments or remarks that Nader just generously gave us. Otherwise, I'll turn right into the Q&A. So Tilman, did you want to reflect on Nader's comments?
Can I just say 2 things? One is thank you, Nader, for your excellent comments. I really enjoyed listening to them, as I always enjoy listening to what you have to say. And my second point is substantial, sort of content-wise. I think the capacity point is really important. I remember visiting Damascus and visiting the National Statistical Agency, whatever the exact name. And, there was just this, this was before the start of the war, there was just this young sort of group of people who were battling the senior management, who were still, stuck in the very old days, and they were just starting with these new World Bank methods and localized poverty estimates, and there's data running on their computer, and it was like the first 2 people, I think, who had data in that agency, and all of that has come to naught now, sadly, and it will take a long time to build that up again. But so capacity in conducting surveys, in defining research questions, in finding researchers willing to do it, in connecting people. It's not enough that there's single people doing this. This needs to be a joint effort, and that takes a village to raise a researcher, something like that. So I think it really needs a community. And maybe very finally, I think the points, for example, about tax authority, I think that's key. That's so important to study in these settings, because of course, as we see in other conflicts, how to finance the war, how to finance the regime, how to finance the post-war recovery is key. And yet the state-citizen relationships, of course, in a post-conflict setting are completely messed up and, very hard to fix on either side. I mean, even the side that might have supported the government will be distrustful, because they see what lengths, governments go to in order to stay in power. And so even if you're a supporter, you will be wary and not keen to part with your money. So I think rebuilding goes through the fiscal sector, and rebuilding the fiscal capacity. But that's only going to work if the macro-micro linkages work. So I think those are some excellent suggestions, and I haven't really seen very much at all. I mean, that's a research gap globally, I think, not just in the MENA region. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilman. So I will start by pointing our attention to some of the questions that are raised in the Q&A, in particular, Mahmoud Liryani, who has 2 comments in there about IDPs, and is asking the panelists if this is part of their research, and wondering if IDPs aren't actually at a disadvantage, even when compared to refugees, because refugees are presumably fleeing to a country that is not in conflict. And so the likelihood of them finding a source of living and health and education services are higher than for IDPs. So any comments or thoughts on the size of the IDP issue, and also on their access to better livelihoods?
Yeah, thank you for both of these excellent questions and comments. I'm afraid I don't have the number right at my fingertip, but it would be relatively easy to find out. But I think it's fair to say that the number of IDPs in general and worldwide, but also in the region, is very high, also in comparison to refugees. Yes, these are both substantial groups of people who face displacement and who face socioeconomic challenges. And I think it's a sort of double-edged sword. If you're a refugee, on the one hand, you have more legal protection. You have, the international norms, the international organizations. There's the international community that, if it gets its act together, which is a big if, could be there to help you. But because you're a foreigner, you face the whole plethora of national regulations and rules, and that's why I talked about work permits for Syrians in Jordan, for example. And, are they integrated? And I mean, the UNHCR is involved in a lot of discussions with national governments to, should you have a sort of one size fits all approach for schooling, for healthcare, for, social transfers. Yeah. So should refugee kids go to the normal schools, or should you have special refugee schools? And if you have special refugee schools, how do you make sure they're maybe not better than the ones that are for the, what's often very remote areas for the local host populations? Yeah. And so I think I think the policy community has recognized that, or at least the aid and humanitarian communities have recognized that. But I think it's a long way to getting national governments to realize how to do that. And the sensitivity around dealing with either the IDP or the refugee communities in your within country setting is usually very high. And so I think it's not clear a priori which subgroup is sort of potentially better off or can get more help. IDPs may have more local networks. They may have more, pre-established, relatives in the capital if they come from the countryside, or vice versa. But they're more invisible. Yeah, they might not, they blend in more. It's not as clear or obvious that there is a need to help them. And so I think that can also present a problem, and the fact that the national government says we take care of them, we don't need outside help. Yeah, whereas foreigners often, are easily passed on to UNHCR and say, you deal with them. It's your mess. Yeah, it's not our national government's problem. And so, yeah, it's very difficult, but it's very important, and it should be studied. And I'm studying it, and I think many other people are also studying this topic. And I hope we make progress on it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. One more question in the Q&A box by Amal Karaki, and it's a two-part question. One is when the research that's just been reviewed was done. So what years does it span, I suppose, and the data potentially what dates does the data come from? But also, I suppose in response to the finding on the work permits, has there been serious consideration of the availability of services and labor market opportunities to refugees, not just access, but availability? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the research as part of this project in the 8 papers uses data from a range of years. Some of it goes back quite far as a way of understanding sort of the origins of people's exposure to violence, for example. So some of it almost has a sort of slight modern historical perspective, which is wonderful and fascinating. As I said in my presentation, understanding what, for example, happened during your childhood. And there's other research in the microeconomic impact of conflict literature, which shows that even what your parents experienced, or even your grandparents, might be relevant for how you capital is and what your psychosocial well-being is. And so these are important factors to consider. And we often need background survey data from previous years to understand that. All local context, to understand what happened in the communities a long time ago. I believe all the papers were made available at the very latest about maybe a year ago. So I think that maybe they were updated since, but I think the papers have been there. So they don't necessarily address 2022 issues, but sadly, perhaps some of these policy and research challenges are sticky. And what's challenging for refugees and IDPs alike, for example, or what labor market challenges were 2 or 3 years ago, are still very pertinent today. And so I would say they remain highly relevant, is my reading. I mean, I've reread all the papers now, like in preparation for our workshop, and I was struck by how relevant they remain. But and then there was a sub question on the labor market. Just a second, I just read it on my screen in front of me. Yes, I mean, it's You mean the availability of services? You mean government services? I'm not quite sure.
Sure.
Samir? Sorry, I see the mic being unmuted. But labor market opportunities, of course, but my view, generally speaking, is there are many labor market opportunities, in most of these economies. And the bigger problem is the legal restrictions around them and the right to work. But many people end up working anyway, even if they're not allowed to. But then they are disadvantaged and they are precarious, and they might end up working not getting paid, or they, the wage rate is even lower, and or they might the money might be stolen from them, or they work very dangerously, etc. So they're pushed into. That's why I said informality. And I think in many settings where people aren't allowed to work, they work anyway, but they work informally, and that's a problem in itself. So I hope I did some justice to the second part of the question. But thank you.
Thank you for that. We have 2 minutes left, and so if there are more questions from the audience, people are invited to raise their hands and speak up and maybe introduce themselves very briefly. And if not, I will not let these 2 minutes get wasted and instead ask a question myself. On one of the incredibly interesting slides that Tilman just presented on data collection in Syria during conflict. So 2 parts questions, very, very quickly, because we really only have very little time left. Sort of a scientific question. Does that, collecting data, survey data in conflicts, does it affect any of the sampling techniques you normally use? What is your population frame? What is your sampling frame? What is representativeness, et cetera? Do you worry about these things? And then sort of a more ethical questions. This is from the researcher in me. IRB, what do you do? How does it work? Do you have any field experience on this and thoughts for other researchers?
Yeah, so of course, I lay awake at night worrying about representativeness and so on. I would say that these are households who may have been displaced previously, but who are currently in a stable setting. And this was a study on food security, and it's actually ongoing, but looking at farming, small scale farming, some more survival activities. And so somebody who does farming is not as mobile as somebody who's not farming. So that made it relatively easy. They're not nationally representative data, but they're representative of a large segment of the population. So small scale rural farmers and and across many of the governorates. So that was very large scale. What does happen is, because it was an impact evaluation, that the intervention, that's what actually was quite variable, and suddenly the intervention sort of shifted and actually covered more those villages, and so what we thought was a treatment area suddenly became a control area. I'm talking very research-oriented stuff now, but so there are more discontinuities and surprises, and it's not as textbook as you would like it to be, and that can be worrying. On the research and ethics side, I think as a researcher, you really need strong partners. Here we partner with the UN, for example, and I wouldn't myself walk into the field and in a place like Syria and start collecting my own data, but doing it with the UN, it's sort of it's not just a formality, but it's just actually, I think, essential. And so in places like Yemen or Libya, I think that would be very difficult. In places which are more, if I can say, fragile, like Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, then I think you can much more sort of civilian research without a large agency on the side. And of course, you have to collaborate with authorities wherever you go. And so, and there are authorities, and that entails cost and prices as well. But maybe that is too much for 2 minutes.
All right. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank both our distinguished panelist and our dear commentator. So thank you both, Tilman and Nadir, and I will hand this back now to Shireen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salty. Thank you, Dr. Brook and Dr. Kabani, for a very rich discussion. And with that, I move with session 2 on post-conflict growth in Mena. And I invite Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, who would be kindly moderating this session, our speaker, Dr. Shahir Zaki, and our lead commentator, Dr. Bassem Youssef. The floor is yours, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Shireen, and also thank you, Nasreen, for setting a very nice protocol for managing the session. So I will follow that strictly. 30 minutes for Shahir, and 5 minutes alert before the end of the 30 minutes, and 15 minutes for Bassam. And the same also, or maybe just 3 minutes before the end for Bassam. And this will leave us 10 minutes. So let me, before I invite Shahir to take the floor, to actually introduce our two main speakers. Shahir Zaki is Professor of Economics, Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University, and Director of Jimenez Egypt, and lead economist at the ARF. He is also a consultant for several international organizations, including the World Bank, the International Labour Office, and the International Trade Center. He has published on international trade, trade policy, trade in services, applied economics, and macroeconomic modeling. Professor Bassam Youssef is a professor of economics at Indiana State University. Bassam Youssef regularly presents and has written extensively on the economic development and political economy of the Middle East, concentrating on Iraq, his home country. His work has led to policy consulting and numerous invited lectures. Youssef's book on the development history of Iraq, Human Development in Iraq, 1950-1990, was published by Routledge in 2012. His current research centers on the political economy of revolt in the Arab world. So we have two distinguished presenters, and we look forward to engaging presentations and commentary and to motivate the general discussion that we will follow. So Shahir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. First, I want to apologize for not being able to attend the first session because I was stuck in traffic jam in Cairo. It was very dense today. So unfortunately, I missed the first part of the presentation, and I think we'll have some overlap between my presentation and the first presentation. So I will try to summarize or go through the first part very quickly, the impact of conflict, and then focus more on the post-conflict part. So thank you for inviting me to present the main findings of the first part of the project. I will mainly go quickly through the first two parts, where I will present the overview of conflicts in the MENA region and the effect of conflicts. And I think this has been thoroughly discussed during the first part of the session, especially at the human capital level. Perhaps I will focus more on the firm dynamics, and then present some insights from the first part also of the project on the post-conflict growth agenda. And then I will conclude with some policy recommendations. So clearly the Middle East and North Africa is one of the regions that has been suffering a lot from different types of conflicts. And if we use the Uppsala data or the ACLED data, we can see that compared to other developing regions, it's one of the most that suffered a lot, especially in recent years, from different types of conflicts. And as you can see in this graph, the increase has been notably, become very remarkable, starting to 2010 until 2019. And in terms of the fatalities of the events, it depends on the events themselves, because different papers from the first part of the project have shown that we have there is a severe impact in terms of the destruction, whether in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, the number of fatalities. And this applies more or less on different types of conflicts, whether they are state-based, non-state-based, one-sided conflicts, and all the details relating to these types of conflicts will definitely affect also the reconstruction, because if it's an armed conflict where we just have, I would say, a classical war, then its dynamics might be different from the fact when it is non-state violence or a one-state violence. If we look especially at the two other types of violences, which are the non-state conflicts and one-sided conflicts, we can see that for non-state conflicts, they decreased. But again, we still have some of these, like the case of Syria. And one-sided conflict, it's also the case in different countries, whether it's Libya, Egypt, Syria, especially against the Islamic State. And one of the characteristics of the conflicts in the MENA region that we have is the internationalization of civil conflicts. And this has been also proved in one of the papers. To what extent this, in some cases, especially for instance in the Libyan cases, it might complicate the post-conflict period if we can qualify some of these countries that they are already in the post-conflict period. And we'll see later that there is no clear definition of whether we have a country that is in a post-conflict or still in the conflict itself. And for instance, in 2019, we have 4 civil conflicts in the MENA region that have been internationalized, and especially with the Libyan one, and we have shown that in the paper with Amal Hamada and Malik Sokman for the Libyan case, and to what extent the internationalization of the conflict in some cases makes the conflict more complicated and complicates also the post-conflict period. And clearly one of the important implications of those different conflicts is the refugees crisis, and this was very clear in the case of Syria, Yemen, and Libya, and to what extent the economic cost associated to the refugees crisis for the country of origin in terms of the human capital that might be lost, and the destination countries that will bear a cost of hosting the refugees, and to what extent this also is can affect illegal migration through North Africa to some European countries. So one final point also related to the refugees crisis, but especially in terms of displacement, is to what extent the displacement, the economic impact of displacement will represent an additional burden for different governments, especially that some of them, they don't have a large fiscal space, as we're going to see later. So after this brief overview of the conflicts and their internationalization and to what extent the economic cost of displacement and of refugees is important, I will go quickly through the effects of conflicts that has been presented, as I said in the first part, and then focus more on the firm dynamics, because we'll be able later to have some policy insights from, in terms of economic growth, from the perspective of human capital and the private sector. So for human capital, I mainly focus on 3 main points. So labor market, children welfare, and public health. And clearly from a labor demand perspective, in the paper with Daniel Mirza and Rita Der Sarkisian, we have shown to what extent firms in the MENA region using the World Bank Enterprise Survey have been negatively affected by the conflicts, and to what extent their productivity also was affected, and how this affects labor demand in these countries. That's from the labor demand perspective and how firms are affected, and I will present this in more details later. But from the labor supply perspective, clearly a conflict and the refugees crisis, they will have an effect on hosting countries, given the substitutability effect that can explain to what extent that there is a negative impact of the Syrian refugee influx on former employment in Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, and this was proven in the paper of Giovannis and Ozdamar in 2020. Hatem Jamali in his paper also was looking at the wage differential between Syrian refugees, natives, and other migrants in Jordan, and to what extent this also can affect the labor market, and to what extent also job mobility can be affected with such refugees crisis. In terms of public health, some other papers focused on to what extent the exposure to terror attacks can affect children and can affect the mental health, and I think this has been presented in the first part. Also with the paper of Iraq, the paper of West Bank, in general, children that are exposed to house raid or arrest of household members, they were more likely to engage in violent behavior, and to what extent this affects later their behavior and consequently the human capital itself of these countries, and to what extent also the public service provision can be affected by the especially in conflict-related areas, and to what extent there's a high cost associated to that, such as the public water access, the mobile water trucks, and so on. The third analyzed in different papers was the child welfare, and clearly why is that important? Because this is the human capital that will determine the future growth of countries, and if in general vulnerable groups such as children are affected by countries, so this means that in the medium term and in the long term the human capital of these countries will be affected. So in the paper of Hatem, he showed to what extent there is the level of inequality of opportunity in access to basic services among children, refugees in host communities, and will be different, especially in terms of the school attendance, in terms of the access to water, to sanitation, in the Jordanian case, and for the study in Iraq that showed that a percentage point increase in conflict in general results in a significant reduction in the hate for age z-score of 0.15%. So in a nutshell, human capital can be affected either from the labor demand perspective or from the human capital perspective in terms of future human capital, which is the mental health and the physical health of children, especially also when it comes to their nutrition. So, and this will be a very important component in the post-conflict period, given the fact that we know that, from the neoclassical theory of growth, that one of the most important determinants of growth in the long run is human capital. So that's why this first point matters. The second point, different dynamics, in the paper with Danielle and Rita, what we tried to do is to rely on the armed conflict and location event data project, which is the ACLED data set, with the geographic information system and the ArcMap software, in order to identify the exact location of different different types of conflicts. And we merged that with the World Bank Enterprise Survey in order to examine to what extent different types of conflicts can affect firms' behavior and firms' performance in different countries. And due to data constraint, we just focused on 6 countries: Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Morocco, and Tunisia. And we focused on 4 main types of conflicts, which are battles and explosions, protests and riots, violence against civilians, and the strategic developments. An important thing that we did in this is that we tried to construct a measure of exposure to an event. And the idea of that index is to determine the proximity of the event to each firm that is located in a specific region. And the other index that was also constructed was the closeness to exposure of major infrastructure, because we know that one of the most important things that affect firms' productivity, and that is also affected by conflicts, is infrastructure installations, whether they are road, airports, ports, and so on. So the main findings the main findings of this paper were that, first, while battles and explosions they negatively affect sales and productivity. Violence against civilians and protests, they have a positive impact. And this effect was relatively robust. It might be counterintuitive, but one of the potential explanations that we had to explain such a positive effect is that it pertains to the adjustment cost that the firms have to bear through the reduction in terms of the number of employees within each firm, which might lead to an increase in productivity in that case. Another thing is the unequal or the heterogeneous effect of conflicts on different types of firms, and it was very clear that small and medium-sized firms are more affected by explosions and battles. And clearly, I mean, from a policy perspective, this is very important. Why? Because we know that more than 95% of the firms in the MENA region are small and medium-sized firms, and this means, bearing in mind also that these firms are those that create most of the jobs. This means that in the short term and in the medium term, job creation can be affected given the fact that these firms, they bear most of the cost of conflict. And one of the findings also was that most of the effect, I mean, the events that we have are not statistically significant for large firms. When it comes to infrastructure exposure to protests and riots, it was very clear that firm sales that are located especially near seaports are much more affected than the other firms. And when we distinguish also between importers, exporters, and firms that are exclusively domestic firms, it was very clear that importers are much more affected than other firms. And this result holds for seaports and for airports. Bearing that in mind, with the effect of conflicts from a human capital perspective, or as it was presented in the first part, the effect on lives and livelihood, and to what extent the private sector also is affected by conflicts, it's important to look at the post-conflict growth. And now I will mainly present some insights based on also some papers and some the project that we're currently working on with Adil Malik. So clearly, an important thing before we present the agenda, it's important to discuss the idea of the post-conflict itself, because there is no universal definition to determine whether a country is already a post-conflict country or not. Some criteria can be used, like signing a treaty or an agreement, repatriation of refugees, disarmament. But again, the presence of such milestones can be necessary but not sufficient to qualify that a country is a post-conflict country, because in some studies it was shown that around 40% of post-conflict countries at the world level have fallen back into conflict within a decade. So to what extent can we qualify that a country is a post-conflict country is a bit tricky. And an important thing to take into consideration when we talk also about post-conflict countries is the structural characteristics of these countries. So Brown and his co-authors in their paper, they distinguish between three types of countries. So first we have the poor or middle income countries that are poor in natural resources, and these countries clearly they have a limited fiscal space. So in terms of spending in the post-conflict period, it will be much more complicated. And they are aid dependent, given the fact that they don't have enough resources, so they will have chiefly to rely on aid. The second group, which are economies that are rich in natural resources, so they have the luxury of spending because they can have enough rents from natural resources. But again, the drawback of that is that there is a high likelihood of having another conflict, given the fact that in general in the literature it has been also shown that natural resources they can increase the likelihood of conflicts onset. The third group is the countries that have ethnic and ideological divisions. And in this case, they might have or might not have enough natural resources, but in all cases, whether they have or they do not have, there is also a high likelihood of having another conflict. So why I'm talking about that? Because this will be important in the choice of the economic policies that will be in place, and the growth model that will have to be adopted in different economies. And clearly, a central question: how also growth will be financed, whether it will be financed through natural resources or it will be financed through foreign aid and foreign assistance from countries or international donors. Clearly, an important prerequisite for most of the recommendations is the institutional part of the post-conflict reforms, because in general, more inclusive institutions, and not just having a democracy or not, but institutions or being able to vote or not to vote, but in a broader sense. And this includes to what extent there is a role for civil society, and whether the civil society is strong or not. What are the constitutional reforms that will be in place, and to what extent they are inclusive if we have an ethnic fractionalization, to what extent there is an engagement of minorities, and to what extent also these minorities are protected. So those new state institutions, in the broad sense of the word institutions, is a key pillar of the different economic reforms that will be implemented in the post-conflict period. And clearly, at the economic level, also an important thing to be taken into consideration is to what extent reconstruction itself is equitable and equally led by the state and by the private sector. And that's why the inclusion of the private sector and the presence of a fair competition on the market in order to have different market players treated equally is a key issue to have a more vibrant or a more dynamic private sector in the post-conflict period. An important thing also from a macro perspective, before presenting the micro part in post-conflict countries, is that in general it's very important that programs should focus on the fundamentals of economic growth, meaning that one of the mistakes that might happen in some cases is that we aim at stabilizing the economy in the short term without really addressing the root causes of the conflict or the structural characteristics of the country that previously led to the conflict itself. So the earlier the programs will focus on the fundamentals of economic growth that prevent the return to a conflict, the easier will be the way forward with the new growth model. And this clearly includes three main, I would say, structural characteristics and one less structural or cyclical. So the three structural characteristics: first, the economic governance functions in the large sense of economic governance or economic institutions in terms of the business environment, in terms of the intellectual property, in terms of the legal dimension of economic policy in general, or the laws that are needed that need to be promulgated, for instance, because in some countries laws, are not even existent, and so it's important first to have the de jure law and then look at the de facto whether it is implemented or not. Second, to restore the government's legitimacy, because this is very important, because if the government has no legitimacy, it will be very difficult to implement different economic policies. And third, because clearly this will affect the well-being of these countries, is to focus on sectors that create jobs. Because one classical problems of most of the countries is that they have more I would say sectors that are capital intensive, and if they are capital intensive, so this means that they will not be able to create jobs, and unemployment will be high, which will lead to potentially another conflict. And the fourth thing to be taken into consideration also is the short-term stabilization. But clearly, while this is necessary, but is not sufficient, because we know that focusing too much on stabilization policies can lead to a certain time inconsistency, in the sense that we will focus just on the short-term objectives without being able to reach the long-term one. So that's why, for the I think the very important part in the post-conflict macro, I would say, model, it's very important to have this balance between structural policies that address long-term objectives and that are in general the root causes of the conflict, versus the short-term stabilization policies that are needed, because we know that fiscal policy, monetary policy, and exchange rate policy are important in the short term, but without falling into this time inconsistency between both. From a macro perspective also, if we distinguish between these two sets of policies, so in the paper of Raimondo and Dr. Samir, they presented different types of macro policies and the importance of, for instance, at the fiscal level, to what extent fiscal institutions matter, and the presence of a fiscal rule in order to limit the budget deficit or the domestic debt, or having a certain level of expenditure or revenues rule. Because, as I presented in the beginning, if we have countries that are poor in terms of natural resources, clearly they don't have the fiscal space, and they will be very dependent on international aid, or they might have very high levels of debt. So that's why in this case, fiscal rules will matter a lot, and the structure also of public spending will matter in the post-conflict period, because we know that from a growth perspective, it's more important to increase the spending to increase productive spending in terms of spending on health, education, and infrastructure, more than current spending in terms of subsidies, in terms of wages, for instance, in the public sector. So this trade-off also between productive and current spending is very important in the post-conflict period. At the monetary policy level, clearly an important thing to be taken into consideration is avoiding a currency overvaluation, or the appreciation that might take place, especially with the inflow of foreign aid from different donors, because this will clearly affect the country's competitiveness. So that's why I think from the stabilization perspective in the short term, those are the two things that might be a priority at the fiscal level and at the monetary policy level. Perhaps in a more medium term, adopting a more transparent monetary policy with an independent central bank in order to curb different inflationary pressures, it might be important, but I think less important than the overvaluation of the currency. From a structural perspective that are long-term oriented, clearly for countries that are oil dependent, the point of the economy diversification and to what extent it's important to develop the industrial sector itself, and to what extent the industrial sector or the industrial policy is mainstreamed within trade policy, and because these goods will be later exported, for instance. And when we talk about trade policy, there is also the political economy behind, and to what extent we might have a resistance from different stakeholders, whether they are interest groups or minorities, or any resistance that can come from more fractionalized countries, and to what extent this might hinder a more open trade policy, or the non-development of some sectors where the country can have potentially a comparative advantage. And clearly this is also very related to the competition and the market structure, because out of, again, political interests, competition can be questioned, which will also affect, in this case, the private sector in terms of investment and in terms of consequently growth. So in a nutshell, what I think that is very important here is to this trade-off that the countries have in the post-conflict period between more structural reforms that are long-term oriented and that might address or that might deal with the root causes of the conflicts themselves. That's on the one hand, and on the other, what is needed in the short term in order to have, growth in the short term, because we know that all the real structural reforms can affect the economy, but definitely not in the long run. From a micro perspective, I'll not go through all these details, because I think they also have been presented in the first part of the seminar today. So the question of refugees and to what extent the integration of refugees in the formal sector and the discrimination against refugees in terms of wages, salaries is important, and to what extent the procedures to obtain work permits, for instance, for refugees are complicated or not, because at the end of the day, refugees are part of the human capital, and in this case, they will affect the growth in the countries. And then the same argument holds also for vulnerable groups in terms of the transfers that are done. And clearly an important question here from a macro perspective will be to what extent countries will have the fiscal space in order to spend on such regular transfer payments for nationals or for refugees. So for instance, in the paper of Ecker and Maestato of 2021, they showed that an unconditional cash transfer must be delivered on a quarterly basis, regardless the amount of the transfer itself. And so the presence just of a regular payment is important. But financing such transfers would clearly be an important thing to be taken into consideration, depending on the fiscal space or the role of international donors. One final thing for the private sector. So it was clear also to what extent firms' performance is affected by infrastructure. So clearly, an important thing in the post-conflict period will be reconstruction, and to what extent this be an important priority of the state or various international donors, because we know that the private sector cannot move forward without that. A second thing, the support that has to be provided to medium firms that bear the main cost, and this is important, especially that in the MENA region, we know this classical missing middle problem, that where we have very small firms and very large firms with very few medium firms. So this, the problem becomes even more complicated if we if small and medium firms are the ones that bear most of the cost. So this is important also to be taken into consideration in the reform in the post-conflict reform period. To conclude, clearly, to summarize all that, I think the key thing will be to what extent institutions after, in the post-conflict period are inclusive or not, to what extent the argument of Sambanis in his paper of 2019 in terms of power sharing institution will increase the political inclusion and will consequently lead to economic policies that are more inclusive and that are better implemented on the one hand. On the other, the new economic social contract, how it will be developed, and how it will mainly focus on the root causes of the conflict itself, and this trade-off that exists between short-term stabilization policies versus long-term, more structural policies that address the real causes of the conflict. So with that, I will stop here, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Shahir. Now the floor is over to Bassam.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say, for everyone, wherever you are, or good evening, perhaps. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Shahir, for an excellent summary, and also Tillman for an excellent presentation. I'm going to keep my comments brief and to allow as people as possible to contribute from the audience. The research, I just want to echo what was said earlier by Nader. That is that this is a hugely important research for our understanding of conflict and rebuilding. And I think as a result, and thank you for all of this, for all of the presentations. And I think we know a lot more as a result. And I can tell from Tillman's and Shahir's presentations this morning that we know a lot more about the research than we knew before we started the undertaking research on this issue. So a number of important things came out, a number of important themes came out in the presentation that Shahir just gave. The different typology that was introduced, vis-a-vis state-backed, non-state-backed, that's very interesting and I think very helpful as valuable background. I think as does the role of foreign actors that's highlighted in research for the role in the continuation of conflicts. I think a number of interesting findings also, and I'm not going to repeat here, but the first size and productivity is very, very important in relation, violence against civilians, location of the violence, findings there are very important, and the relevance of cash transfers. Very important, and the one that I want to emphasize more actually is the finding on labor demand and labor supply. I thought the discussion there was very interesting. Just if I could take you, if I could ask a question or pose a question to you, Shahir, or possibly to anyone else to answer, is how does this fit in with the sort of general employment situation that we find in Mena, where we have really a very, very low responsiveness of employment to changes and to rising productivity and rising production level and rising GDP. This actually appeared fairly recently, I think, in an ERF kind of presentation of to highlight the work of that Ragias and Mohammed Marwani are doing on this. They did it with respect to North Africa. And actually, Khalid Ismail and UNESCO have done a lot of work on this. I conferred a few months back with Khalid about this when I was writing on this very specific issue. And how does that link to our policies or to our views of what is appropriate policy post-conflict? And I recognize that post-conflict is a difficult thing, or maybe not an easy thing to define, because there isn't there isn't one definition of it. Does it change our analysis at all, or how would it inform our analysis? Is this another justification furthermore to have a basic income scheme in these countries? That's the question I have. And I'm putting this in the context of the low employment elasticity of output that is prevalent in many developing countries, and in many Middle East countries, and notably the ones that are emerging from conflict. The second major point that I wanted to raise is, what is your view? What is the view of state-private sector interactions? And I think that one way in which to view the state-private sector interactions, and perhaps this is the only way, of course, but instead of going into the whole sort of idea of corruption, often I think we think of corruption, we think of the way in which it's dealt with post-Reconstruction or post-conflict within the Reconstruction as being a very important issue. And certainly it is. But sometimes I think we tend to think of it in behavioral terms, so that it's something that is done, something that is not done. An alternative way might be to consider rent flows. How can flows actually, and rent flows, you can think about it as corruption, or you can think about it as flows, let's say, from the state to private industry, encouraging certain activities and discouraging other activities. How can those can that be used to conceptualize how the public-private interaction or partnership would look like going forward? In other words, if you want to institute a certain kind of government policy, what do you direct rents to? If you want to institute a certain kind of industrial policy, perhaps the one that encourages employment, how would you construct a policy around that? How would you direct your rents in that particular situation? That would be an interesting avenue. I think that there's some work that's been done on this. So, for example, Mushtaq Khan argues that look, countries that were actually quite where there was quite a bit of corruption have actually developed. He cites Syria in the 1960s and China more recently in the 1980s. And his argument is look, you can think of these things as a rent, and in some instances, rents actually go towards instituting and encouraging innovation and development and building infrastructure and investment. Other instances, they don't. So the question is to identify those instances where they do encourage innovation and so on. Another point that I wanted to emphasize or that I wanted to bring up is this issue of how does a recovery building from conflict interact with climate change? Particularly in the case of Syria and Iraq, these are countries that are very heavily affected by climate change, and these are also countries where a large portion of the labor force is still engaged in agriculture. I say large. I mean, in the case of Iraq, for example, it's about 1 in 5. So it's not huge, but it's still significant. So how does the effect of climate change interact with prospective policies post-conflict? Finally, and I think this is an important point to bring out, but I think it's worthwhile talking about this. What is our view of inclusive political arrangements and inclusive economic arrangements? Are we putting forward the view that inclusive political arrangements are a necessary condition for inclusive economics? I just finished an ERF project about the Herat that I can contest this notion about whether inclusive politics actually leads to inclusive economics. In fact, we argue that political inclusion can actually reduce state capacity and can actually check economic inclusion. It's coming out soon, but the point that I'm making here isn't that. The point is that you can view political inclusion as Sen, for example, does, Amartya Sen does, as good in its own terms. That is to say that they don't need to that it may or may not have. He would argue that there are positive effects, that there are intrinsic. That there's an intrinsic value to inclusive political institutions. There's also an instrumental value. But the argument that I'm making is that it's good in its own term, and it may be good. It's good in its own terms, and it may be important in achieving other objectives too. But my point is if we do have this is a long-running debate, by the way, in development economics. I mean, this goes especially back into the 1960s and ideas of where it was thought that sort of liberal politics was an expensive luxury good, and that it was too expensive for developing countries to undertake that. And this goes back to Gunnar Myrdal's ideas of a soft state and so on and so forth. The question there's an opposite tendency though, and that's to go back and assume that almost that there is that inclusive politics is a must for inclusive economics. The problem with that is that we may be waiting for a long time in the Middle East if we institute that kind of assumption for inclusive politics. I think that the question that I'm raising is, do we need policies that actually bypass that? Do we need policies that, let's say, rely less on having an inclusive polity, but towards creating an inclusive economics? Is that possible to? And I'm hoping that it is, and I wanted to get your reaction out of that. That's all I have, and I think I've saved some time. Ibrahim, I'm bringing it over to you.
Thank you very much. Very succinct, very informative, and also keeping with time. Thank you, Wassam. We have, I think, 2 questions on the chat, as well as, of course, the opportunity is also available for raise hands. So let us start with raise hands. If somebody wanted to directly comment by raising hand. Otherwise, we can start with I have Samir, but since Samir is actually the boss here, let's start with some relative outsiders, and then we'll give Samir another chance at the end. I think there is a question, very important question by Dr. Noha Al-Mekkawi about the point about balancing short-term stabilization and long-term structural reform is crucial. Does the team have any examples of countries in conflict outside of MENA having addressed this paradox? This question, I think, could also be addressed by Raimundo and Samir, in addition to Shahir. Shireen, I didn't get the second question, but could you please read the second question on the chat?
There's the question that you've mentioned from Dr. Noha Mekkawi. There's also a question from Dr. Amal Karaki about the classification of post-conflict countries should not be very categorical. Some countries might be poor and at some time considered countries who have serious ethnic issues leading to conflict. And I think that Shahira was planning to respond to live. And if I may also bring your attention, Dr. Barbara Chenstone had a comment, I'm not sure if that was completed, questions about refugees returning in the post-conflict period. So I don't know if she wanted to elaborate on that or have the floor. Back to you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay. Okay, you're also welcome, Dr. Barbara. This is Barbara Cheston, right?
Correct, Doctor. Yes, it is.
Yeah,
she's continued. Yeah, she's continued with her question. She's continued with her question in the chat. What is the impact on the new post-conflict economy state building effort of refugees returning home? Second, do refugees bring home new skills, demands? Third, are they poorer, in a position to help rebuild? Are they a burden to the post-conflict state? 4, to what extent policies for rebuilding the economy state affect the decision of refugees to go home? 5, are refugees pushed more than pulled home? 6, is there an ideal time for going home? So it's a whole list. It's in the chat. And if Dr. Barbara would like the floor, we're happy to do that. Back to you.
Okay. Any other question before I give the floor to Shahir, Samir, and Raimundo?
No, that's all.
Any question? Okay. Let me actually then, in that case, relatively abuse my vantage point as a chair and make a couple of comments. The first comment really is about political settlement. I'm very much inspired by the paper that I wrote with my colleague Norman Loaiza on Syria, and how investment and institutional reform, including macro reform and all of these, are inextricably linked to political settlement. So we actually simulated economic recovery under three scenarios. One of them is the sushi, the Russian concocted kind of plan for peace, which is not going to bring enough dividends. It will take more than 20 years for Syria under this plan to reestablish its 2010 GDP per capita. The same thing for, but then the more robust political settlement, if implemented, Syria might actually be able to recover in less than a decade. So if you think of the situation of Yemen and Libya, and now Sudan, and even countries like Lebanon, which are not exactly in war, political settlement is key for development and growth. So I think this is one area that probably we need to pay attention to in the future. The second thing is really about a cautionary note about, which I think, but some might have alluded to it, a cautionary note about power sharing. Because really, if we take the case of Sudan, power sharing actually has been given a bad name because it became just a coalition of military protagonists, the government, and which is a military institution or a military regime, and the rebels. And so the civil society and the civilian institutions did not really have any space in the political process. And I think the same thing could be said about Iraq, where actually sectarian parties and the armed groups, basically took over in the name of, power sharing. So I think that's a cautionary note which I just wanted to highlight. So back to you, Shahir, and followed by Samir and Raimundo.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. I'll try to be brief and give the floor then to Dr. Samir and to Raimundo. To respond, I'll just respond to some questions. The first one on Bassem's question on labor market. I think clearly one of the structural issues that complicate the labor market, I would say the labor market characteristics that can complicate the post-conflict period, I think, can be mainly three main characteristics. The first one is the extent of the informal sector, and to what extent the informal sector can be even more, can deteriorate or can increase, especially with the refugees crisis, and how the government will have to deal with this huge informal sector on the one hand. On the other, that a structural problem also of most of the MENA economies is that sectors that are in general, sectors that have a comparative advantage in these countries are in general more capital intensive than labor intensive, which means that the likelihood of creating jobs through these sectors in order to reduce unemployment is not very high. With a few exceptions, such as the perhaps ready-made garment sectors, the processed food sectors, but in general, most of the other sectors where they have a comparative advantage are more capital intensive. And I think this also an important thing that will affect the growth model in the post-conflict period. The third characteristic is also the extent of the vulnerable groups when it comes to youth, women, and all the vulnerable groups, or informal workers, or less educated people, or blue collars, for instance. So in general, all these vulnerable groups that might even, suffer more, either with an important refugees crisis or with the inability of the country to focus on sectors that are able to generate employment for these vulnerable groups. So that's, I think, the more general or the more structural view of the labor market. I totally agree with you on this interaction between state and the private sector, and to what extent it's important to look at that from a behavioral perspective and the political economy perspective also of that. Perhaps two final things, and perhaps Dr. Samir and Dr. Raimundo would like to add something on the stabilization versus, short-term stabilization versus long-term structural measures. We're currently working on that in order to see what are the different policies that have been implemented in countries that are different from the MENA region. That's the paper with Adil Malik, the second phase of the project. So next webinar, I hope we'll have some more concrete examples on that. But I think the most important thing is on how to, how to have a compromise of these two without affecting the short-term stabilization that is necessary, but at the same time to avoid this time inconsistency in the long run. I totally agree also with the comment of Dr. Amal Karaki that this distinction or this classification is not really categorical, because definitely we have some overlapping between them. But I think the two criteria that based on them we can split the countries is first, the abundance of natural resources or not, because this will affect their dependency on foreign aid and their fiscal space. And second, to what extent the countries are fractionalized or not, or with different kind of fractionalization. And based on these two criteria, we can have, I think, or I believe, 4 types of countries depending on these two characteristics. So perhaps I will stop here, and Dr. Samir and Raimundo, if you want to add something.
You're in mute, Samir.
Okay. You hear me?
Sure.
Thank you very much, Shahid. That was very, very interesting presentation, and also the comments of Sam. First, let me take a point that Brahim raised on power sharing. And looking at the Lebanese context, Brahim, I think it has been a failure. Power sharing, at least outside some kind of a foreign power imposing its will on Lebanon, at least sectarian power sharing has led to tremendous corruption and tremendous instability in Lebanon. So I'm very much unhappy with what the Lebanese experienced and the whole thing of power sharing as it has developed here. The second point is on the question that Shahir raised on post-conflict growth and countries that go back to conflict. Right, Shahir? You said there are conditions such as why they go back there. They are poor countries or rich countries with natural resources, or that they are plagued with ethnic divisions. These have led or caused countries that had gone out of conflict to go back to conflict. So in the case of the Arab countries, we have 5 countries. Only 2 are post-conflict, namely Egypt and Tunisia. In your opinion, in your assessment, how stable are they? And to what extent are the conditions you talk about, possibility of going back to conflict, applied to Egypt and to Tunisia? These are my questions, Brian.
Are you waiting for me, Shahid?
Thank you, Samir. Raimundo?
Oh, yes. I will first thank everyone for the enlightening conversation. The second is that I don't know how I managed to get myself into this kind of commenting Shahid and trying to answer questions. Anyway, I'll go back to Noha Mikawi comment, which is, of course, a very important one. she asks whether balancing short-term stabilization and implementing longer-term structural reforms is crucial, and what do we know about that? It is crucial, of course. Stabilization allows for reform to be implemented, and reforms allowed for stabilization to be reinforced. So there is a way to generate, or there should be ways to generate a virtuous circle in which one type of policy reinforces the other. Most of the evidence we have is that that virtuous circle is actually not there. So it fails for different reasons. Perhaps one thing is that stabilization and short-term policies are all about feasibility, what can be done at a certain point in time, whilst long-term reforms are about optimality, what is the best long-term situation that we would like to have. And most of the time there is a conflict between what is feasible against what is optimal. And I'm not so sure we have a clear understanding whether feasibility constrains optimality or optimality should guide feasibility. My hunch is that there may be cases for everything, policies that are feasible but not optimal, policies that are optimal but not feasible, and the like. We are working with Samir and Razan on a paper trying to look at exactly things like that, but separating two scenarios. One is that when you're moving from peace to conflict, and the other one is when you have a conflict, you have a peace agreement, and it fails. So there's two ways of recurring to violence as a way to solve a problem. And for the first one, you may be in a situation of peace or relative peace, or where at least political instability is not there. And then your economic system or your political system, or both, are unable to handle a shock or unable to handle a chronic situation, and you move into violence. The other one, which is very different, is when you already have a peace agreement, whether a good one or a bad one, whether supported by the entire population or a part of the population, and it fails. And it so happens that stabilization matters a lot for failure. So we're working with 125 countries. Not all of them have been into conflict, but many of them are. And what we find out is that stabilization plays a crucial role to avoid the failure of a peace agreement, and thereby to avoid a recurrence to violence. So it might be the case that whatever we call moving from peace to conflict is very different when you already sign a peace agreement and you already have political will to move forward than when you don't have it. But that we can discuss tomorrow, because it's part of the second part of the project we are dealing with Samir. The other thing that I would like to mention is that, very briefly, is that this point about stabilization and longer-term structural reforms may have two dimensions. One is the economic dimension, and the other one is the, if you want, the grievance kind of situation, where you address problems without any market kind of policy. So there is no trade-off between short-term and long-term policies. You just move into long-term policies for non-market situations or cases. For example, if the grievance is about inclusion, that is not a market policy, and you can move very quickly into the long-term situation. Economic policies, on the other hand, or economic issues on the other hand, might take a long time, and there may be a trade-off between stability and reforms. But in other dimensions, which are really very important, because if you look at literature, they would say that the grievances are really, really very important, and those can be addressed without this trade-off between stabilization or without much of a trade-off between stabilization and long-term reforms. So political participation, for example, can be addressed, in my view, without that trade-off. I'll stop here, but I think that Noha's point is crucial. Yeah. Tomorrow we will have a little more on this.
Thank you so much, Thank you so much. This is most informative and interesting, and we look forward to tomorrow, right? Tomorrow the same time, start at 3 o'clock Cairo.
Yes, Dr.
Right.
Ibrahim, yes, indeed.
Okay, so over to you, Shireen, if you want to have any other matters to
No, I
announce.
just want to extend deep gratitude لحضرتك, Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Shahir, and Dr. Bassem for another very rich discussion. And thank you, Raimondo, for coming in, both you and Dr. Samir, into the discussion, and for the very insightful questions as well we've had. And yes, we'll be looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, inshallah, at 3 o'clock. We have 2 sessions tomorrow, one on regional cooperation and conflict in Mena, where the session is going to be moderated by Dr. Sidlo, and our speaker is Dr. Ahmed Ghonaim, and our lead commentator is Dr. Lahsan Ashay. And then we have our 4th session on regional experiences and lessons learned, with Dr. Adil Malik moderating and Dr. Raimondo Soto as our speaker, and Dr. Noha Mekawi as our lead commentator. And then we'll be closing with the closing remarks in presence of Dr. Samir Maqdisi, Dr. Raimondo, Dr. Shahir, and Dr. Chantal. So very, very exciting agenda also tomorrow. And with that, I see you and look forward to seeing you tomorrow, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Good evening. Bye-bye.